Whether it be camping, hiking, or simply just enjoying the nature, being out in the middle of nowhere can turn deadly real fast. These subscribers share their creepiest experiences out in the middle of nowhere. If you have a story that you'd like to hear on the channel, be sure to send it to the email or the website that you can find in the description down below. I would love to share your story with everyone else. Let's get into these creepy tales. I always tune out paranormal stories because I have insomnia and prefer not to spook myself out at night. Though, this is a paranormal story, and my eyes water and goosebumps grow whenever I start to tell it. I was born and raised in Southern California. All of my family surfs. We used to love beating the crowds on a big swell day by dipping south into Baja. My youngest brother, we'll call him Nick, moved to Northern California for college, and soon the rest of my siblings would take surf trips up there to see him. Extremely impressed by the big empty surf up there, I began taking 10-day trips up to see him. It's a 500-mile drive, so once I get past LA, I will camp drive for a few ways, and surf 2 or 3 spots a day. In general, I would take up about 3 days to go up the coast, 3 days with Nick, and 3 days to go back down the coast, just driving and surfing the whole time. On one trip, there was a strong building swell, and I was getting pretty close to my brother's town. After surfing once earlier in the day, I was passing a beach I never surfed before, when a ripping, fast, hollow, and ledgy right made my jaw drop. I pulled over on the cliff, cracked a beer, and started watching this near-perfect wave peeling away. I started suiting up, and was caught off guard by a funny feeling. I saw another wave ripping down the point, and it was enough to shake off that feeling. I spotted a way to get down the cliff, and then, the second my foot hit the mossy rocks at the bottom, an intense wave of negativity, nervous emotion, and etc. tore through my body like a bolt of lightning. I try not to read into spooky paranormal activity, but this was too overpowering. Not another soul around for miles. I decided I needed to heed my intuition and noped out. My brother's town was only a half an hour away, so I met with him and surfed Big Ocean Beach for the next few days. The swell was triple overhead, plus was empty until it dropped down to head high on a Saturday, and the place was packed with kooks. Walking back to the parking lot, I was describing that beach I saw to Nick and mentioning we should go there because it wouldn't be crowded. This is where my goosebumps come back even typing this. He looked me in the eye and said, "No bro, you don't want to surf there. It's haunted by many spirits. A lot of gnarly stuff goes down out there. From families getting swept out to sea, to less than a decade ago, a father took his son there and chopped him up alive into pieces. I still haven't surfed that beach, and it creeps me out to the core." As a preface to this story, my grandmother died just a week before this happened, and I was very close to her, so understandably, I took it very hard. Anyway, almost 2 years ago, I was driving alone at night at around 2:30 a.m. I was up in the mountains, headed towards home, the scenic route, as I like to call it, clearing my mind. At the time, I just had so many negative thoughts going through my head about my grandma. I stopped at the quick fill on the way to fill up and get a drink because I was parched. When I came back outside, I felt an odd chill in the air. This really didn't bother me at the time because I was a hockey player and was used to the cold. But I got back in my car and headed back out on the road. The road I was on was a 2-lane mountain road with thick vegetation on either side. I happened to be driving enough to catch a figure out of the corner of my eye. So I stopped to check it out when I got a good look at a person. It was an old woman who was sitting on the side of the road. Nobody or nothing around to make me believe her having a reason to be sitting there. I motioned for her to come over to my car. She did, and when she got there, I rolled down the window. I asked her what she was doing, and she said she did not know. So I asked if she needed a ride, and she said no, that would be fine. So I handed her a $10 bill and said there was a quick fill up the road, if she needed something to go up there and buy. I also warned her to watch out for coyotes because they get pretty hungry at around this time. She nodded and then said thanks, and then grabbed my arm and said, "Everything will be alright, Gus. Trust me." Now, I didn't want to make a deal about this at the time, but Gus wasn't my real name. It was a nickname that I was given as a kid that I hated, and I only allowed my grandmother to use it. So I drove off, and then she walked to the side of the road and disappeared. I thought nothing of it and kept driving. I pulled up to a stoplight closer to my house and noticed movement to the right of my car. 3 men in ski masks started walking towards my car, one brandishing a gun. I froze, not knowing what to do and not have anything on me to defend myself, so I stared back at them. But then, they just stopped moving and got wide-eyed looking at something beyond my car. They slowly moved back in the opposite direction, and once they were out of sight, I turned to look, hoping I would get to see what was freaking them out. And to my surprise, the same woman was standing there on the side of the road at the street. She looked at me and smiled. I got out of my car and went over there, but before I could get to her, she said, "Your grandma would be proud," and then she vanished, leaving the $10 bill and the distinct smell of my grandma's perfume. Most people would be weirded out by such an experience, but I felt that somehow I saw my own guardian angel. I can't explain what happened to me that night in the middle of nowhere, but I'll always remember it. I live out in a good rural area, and generally, none of us really mess with any paranormal stuff. I personally would never mess around with Ouija boards, and you shouldn't either. A Ouija board is kind of like the other side's equivalent of some sort of blog site. You put an open invitation out there to anything, really. I say anything because there are things out there far worse than malevolent spirits and poltergeists. I'm talking real evil here. The kind of stuff that puts every horror movie out there to shame. I know, because I've seen it. All because of a Ouija board. My sister, cousin, and myself had gotten the stupid idea to buy a Ouija board and use it. It was close to Halloween and we wanted a good scare. Though, we had our doubts it would work since it was a cheap board made by Hasbro. We were still curious. We waited for a day that no one was home, and then until midnight to use the board for the full spooky effect, and we even lit a couple candles. So there we were, 3 stupid teenagers sitting in a circle around a board, doing the same thing I called out every protagonist in a horror movie for doing. For a while, we just asked the typical, "Is anyone there?" and "Is someone here with us?" My sister got bored and pushed the pointer in an attempt to mess with us. I knew it was her and called her on it. Yes, I'm Captain Killjoy, but seriously, I wanted to know if this thing worked or not. But her reaction made my cousin laugh, so it wasn't a total loss. After a minute though, things got weird. I say that because that's the only way I can describe it. It was like that eerie, strange calm before something awful happens, but you can't quite put your finger on it. The pointer moved. Okay, it moved. No one pushed it, and no one was messing around this time. It was pretty obvious by the complete shock on our faces. It slowly spelled out, "Hello." We looked at each other, exchanging looks of shock and excitement. But I know, now we should have been afraid. Very afraid. "Who are you?" my sister asked, excitement in her voice. The pointer moved again, and its painfully slow pace from one letter to the next spelled out, Danny. If there are words to adequately describe what I felt at this moment, I don't know them. As cliche as it must sound, my stomach flipped, my heart sank, and I think I stopped breathing. You see, that's the name of a friend of mine who had killed himself a few years ago. This occurred that same year. I don't know why, I don't know how, but somehow, I knew this wasn't my friend. There was just this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that whatever was using the board was not the guy I grew up with. "We should put the board away," I suggested, hoping that they too had this feeling and wanted to put the damn thing away and never speak of it again. The pointer moved, but this time more violently. I nearly freaked out as it tore out of our hands and it moved so fast, spelling no. Then, the candles went out, plunging us into darkness. We practically yelled goodbye and shoved the pointer to where we thought goodbye text was. We grabbed our phones and turned on the flashlight and sat quietly for a minute, too shaken up to get up or move or even speak. What happened next is something I'll never forget as long as I live. My sister's face contorted in horror, and she pointed behind me, screaming and shaking with terror that I have never seen in another person. I felt an excruciating pain in my lower back, and then my shirt start to grow warm and damp. I cried out before scrambling forward and whipping around to face whatever had hurt me. There was something in the darkness. Something that reminded me of why we once feared the dark. It had the vague shape of a man, but it wasn't a man. It was far too large to be a man. Its body bulged and convulsed like some repulsive pus-filled mass that was as black as the darkness it hid in. And its face, I still see it in my nightmares. It had these beady, perfectly round eyes that reflected the light like an animal. It had no nose or ears to speak of, and its horrifyingly wide mouth was spread into a grin that was too far and way too big for its bony face. I was terrified. I was not only scared beyond all words for my own life, but for the lives of my sister and cousin. Being the stupid teenager I was, I showed anger towards the thing and rose shaking a hand at it and yelled, "You are not welcome here! Get out!" What happened next is blurry. It all happened so fast. The thing's face twisted into a raged expression, and all I could think to do was keep screaming, "Get out!" Our phones turned off at the exact same time before immediately rebooting. I don't know who got to the light first. All I know is all three of us were huddled by the light switch holding it on. The creature was gone, banished with the light. At least, that's what I hoped. My sister was in tears, babbling about my lower back. My cousin took a look and said it looked like it had been stabbed by a wide knife. I couldn't tell my mother. She'd lose her mind. So I used my amateur first aid skills and with my cousin's help, patched myself up. My sister didn't say anything for a while after that. I have never seen her that shaken. It was all I could do to console her. Right after that, I smudged the whole house and did everything I knew how to get rid of the energy. And dare I think it, the creature. I have no idea why we didn't die that night, or why my outburst made that thing leave. All I know is we never saw that thing again, and we agreed to never bring that night up. The board sits gathering dust now, since I never got the chance to burn it. I still have the scar where that thing cut me, so take it from me. Never, ever mess with Ouija boards. As always, locations and names have been altered to prevent compromises of operational security and to avoid statute of limitation breaches. After the first incident at the forward operating base, things were never quite the same for me. For an incident that technically never happened, it certainly didn't stop from word getting around among the other soldiers. Commanding officers treated me differently, not necessarily negatively or positively, but there was always a notion of suspicion or condescending tone with every order. Then again, I wasn't that high up on the totem pole. I was just a specialist, and even then, there were other specialists and even some privates who would occasionally approach me and ask me what happened. And they'd always laugh and then ask what actually happened. Seems like, over the course of a few weeks, I had gone from respected specialist to a sensationalized joke. This particular post had me stationed a bit deeper in the mountain. This meant more dirt roads, more trees, and infrastructure had dropped to non-existence. There weren't even villages at this point, just houses, and I do use that term lightly, scattered among the mountainside. One major difference was that they lived in these houses. They were far more recluse than the villagers, and were evidently unhappy with an American presence. In one case, I was assigned to go up and check up on a woman who lived fairly deep within the rainforest. As these mountains were prone to mudslides during the rainy season, even more so now that the hurricane had passed. The rain in Guatemala would put any rain in the United States to shame. It didn't even have raindrops, more like rain globs, and the thunder out there was so powerful you could practically feel the sound booming above your head. The steady rain clouds above us had left the skies a dull gray, and deep in the rainforest it was dark enough to where we needed to use flashlights. Thankfully, when we arrived at the woman's house, we found that not only was it intact, but she was even cooking. However, our arrival was not met with joy, but with anger. The old woman quickly called out to her husband, who rushed over to tell us to leave. I of course had to translate for my other squad mates. After some few choice words, the man had spewed at the group in its entirety. He had told me that we need to leave immediately. That mountain did not like being disturbed, and that others were not allowed to stay longer because they were in danger. In this instance, it isn't uncommon for people to stash drugs or even process drugs for the local cartels. It's just a fact of life. I did my best to explain that we were just here for a wellness check. He stood firm, however, that we needed to leave, and refused to speak to us further. Given as how we can't exactly force anyone into accepting help, we opted to turn back. The entire time we were headed back, everyone felt uneasy. I was too, just not for the same reasons. Everyone was too busy worrying about some cartel ambush, but what had me on edge was that it had grown silent again. Well, as silent as it could be with a rainstorm going on. By the time we had arrived at the Humvee, we were shocked to see what appeared to be 3 women looking over at the Humvee. They were practically crawling all over it. Their demeanor was almost feral, awkward, almost painful looking movements from equally disheveled looking women. My mind immediately flashed back to the woman in the road from a few weeks earlier. I quickly warned my squad mates to be careful, but none of them took me seriously. In fact, our point man Davis broke formation to literally chase these women away by shouting at them in a broken Spanish that they needed to get away from the vehicle or risk being detained. If we didn't have their attention before, we certainly had their attention now. Now, as I stated earlier, there was no real infrastructure this deep in the mountain, meaning there weren't any streetlights, and the further in the day it came, the darker it got. By now, we definitely needed our flashlights, and despite being armed, what terrified me was that I could see their eyes reflect the light any time it passed over them. Davis either didn't notice or didn't care, because he had cockily walked up to one of them and pushed her back to the vehicle only to have his hand literally bitten by one of these women. Davis didn't even have time to howl in pain before the other 2 women literally jumped on top of him and began savagely clawing and punching him. Their feral shrieks almost sounded like twisted and demented language. The rest of us ran quickly to help Davis, who by now was barely even putting up a fight. I took the first shot, since by now, escalation via words or warning shot clearly wasn't going to be enough. Quickly followed by my squad mates, who also fired off a few rounds. One of the women was downed instantly, and the other two quickly bolted into the foliage. Again, I was reminded of how lucky we were to be in gear. Davis was alive, if only just. His hand was bloody, but even though all the blood we could see was from deep marks on the woman's teeth, his hand was clawed up pretty badly, and his jacket was practically shredded. It was like they were trying to tear away his gear to get at the body underneath. The woman that had been shot was still breathing. I quickly ordered my other squad mate, Haley, to dial a 9-line med evac, while I examined the woman. She had been shot in her side, and yet she wasn't bleeding heavily. In fact, the blood that did come out from her wound was chunky and smelled horrid. I gagged, barely capable to even stand near this woman. Her eyes darted about in a crazed fashion, and she still tried snapping at me, however far weaker since she was clearly wounded. Her fingernails were long, pointed even, and still had a bit of Davis's flesh beneath them. I did my best with the wound, cleaning it off and bandaging it as well as I could. The woman was restrained to keep her from attacking should she gain her strength back. Again, our superiors told us to stand by. When the med team arrived, and so did 2 other Humvees, each filled with soldiers armed much heavier than we were. Again, we were pulled aside, debriefed, and taken off duty. This time, I was put under a psych evaluation, post-debriefing again. I was told that this did not happen, but I wasn't transferred. Instead, they kept me on the base duty. I was not to leave the base on any more relief missions. Officially, Davis was sent home? Unofficially, rumors had spread that he had died of some sort of infection. Something that made him pale and thin. Something that made his flesh rot and made him aggressive, almost rabid before he passed. When my deployment was over, I did not sign up for another one. I haven't gone back to Guatemala since. I likely never will. Something is out there. Something is in those mountains. Something that doesn't like to be bothered by loud vehicles or people treading where they shouldn't be. The locals know it, and we know it. The question is, what is it? When I was growing up, I had a cousin. Her name was Kendra, and her family home was surrounded by a few miles of forest. I won't tell you what state this is, because there's a plethora of reasons for that. I lived a few miles away from where Kendra lived. I was at her house more than I was at mine. She had everything I could ever dream of. A big house, no siblings, and best of all, a dog. The dog was a German Shepherd Malamute Wolf Lord, knows what else mix. Kendra found her roaming around the woods. Kendra later named her Shadow. Kendra and I were 6 at the time. The vest guesstimated that Shadow was 7 years old as well. We loved to explore the woods, and Shadow would go with us. Even though she was always off leash, she would always come back home with us. The winter Shadow died we were 14. The cold wind and snow was blowing around outside. Shadow was lying right next to the fireplace. Kendra just looked up from her book and whispered, "It is the end," and looked at Shadow. It looked like 1,000 colors erupted from Shadow's body and formed the shape of a wolf above Shadow. The wolf then raised his head, howled, and ran to the forest. I will admit it reminded me of the scene of the last episode of the original Thundercats, where the cat in the eye of Thundera ran and unfroze the other Thundercats. We both got up and ran to check on Shadow, only to discover her dead. I don't know how Kendra knew what was going to happen, but she always had a spiritual connection to the wild, and Shadow was truly wild like Kendra. Even on the day Kendra knew, I still remember the sadness in her eyes as she turned to me to go. "I will miss you, but the wild calls to me. I'll always be here with Shadow, but I must go. Please don't mourn for long. One day you will hear the call of the wild too. Just follow Shadow." I also saw a type of understanding in her eyes, her bright jade green eyes. I will always remember her last words. Those were the most words I had ever heard her say. She was always so quiet, but before she ran off, I swear I saw a shadow in front of her. That was impossible though. It had been a year since Shadow died. I tried to follow her, but she ran through bushes, and no matter how effortless she made it look, I could not follow her through the bushes. I remember running faster than I ever ran before to get back to Kendra's parents' home. I made them follow me back to where she ran off and told them everything that happened. They immediately called the cops. The police dogs led the cops straight to her body. Somebody had slit her neck. Her beautiful, long blonde hair was matted with blood. They never caught her killer. Her parents moved to Canada a few years later. They bought a house and they've been living there ever since. I now hear the call of Kendra, sometimes in my sleep. I'm going to investigate. I assume I will be killed too. I'm going to figure out who killed her. I'm not crazy, and I will let you guys know if I find anything. I had an experience many years ago that I finally put down on paper. It was in 2003 when I was moving from California to New York. I haven't mentioned this story to anyone except those closest to me, because my fear is that talking about it will bring it back to me. It's bad enough to keep haunting memories in hidden caverns of my mind. I don't also want people to think that I lost my mind out in the Arizona desert on that starry night. I live in Denmark now, so that night in the American desert seems like a world and an era away. Nothing happened to me in the sense of the body. While it was happening, it was terrifying and traumatizing. I have never been so scared, so alone, in such a huge empty world, and in such imminent danger as that night. If you fear that talking about or reading about animal spirits can conjure them into your life, I recommend that you stop reading here. Here's my story. I had taken a job offer in New York City and quit my job in San Francisco, so I had a month in between of free time. This was just a couple of years after university, so I have friends that have moved back from our university town in Santa Cruz to various places around the country. With this free month, I could do what I wished, so I packed my things, everything I owned, into my pickup truck with a camper top and headed out on the road to visit my college friends around the country while driving to New York. Honestly, I lost track of time in Los Angeles after many nights at various venues and events. I'd been crashing at the apartment of my friend Kyle. Actually crashing at the apartment of some girl that Kyle was crashing at, as there was always another event being promoted or reason to stay a few more days. I woke up on a Tuesday morning, wrote a goodbye note, and ventured out to find my pickup truck with all my stuff. It was a bit of a panic, because it had been stolen. The only physical possession I would still have in this world would be left to my knapsack on my shoulder. I found my truck and pulled out, heading for Las Vegas. The next city I wanted to visit was a friend in Atlanta, but I figured I'd do some solo adventuring and hit Las Vegas and the Grand Canyon while in this part of the country. When I came to the desert town of Barstow, which is a couple hours east of Los Angeles, I lost control of the truck for a second, grabbed the steering wheel and managed to pull over haphazardly, but safely, to the shoulder of the highway. This was lucky, as the highway had a lot of big trucks. I got out to inspect, and my back left tire was flat. These details are not part of the experience in Arizona, but set the scene leading up to it. I was feeling a little of a daze for several days after socializing with wannabe celebrities in Los Angeles, followed by what felt like a very unsafe and shocking experience on the desert highway. I switched out the flat tire for the spare. Each time a big rig would be heading my way, I would literally run around my parked pickup truck to avoid it and stay safe. The flat tire being on the left side of my truck meant I had to jack up the truck and do my work with my body situated just by the most right lane of the highway. This is the lane that the big trucks like to drive on. All was fine, and I could drive a few miles until I found a tire repair shop. It was a small cheap shop somewhere in the desert, run by Spanish-speaking Mexicans. The shop was one of those cinder block and aluminum workshops with plenty of tires hanging along the wall, with cheap prices painted on the tires with white paint. It turns out that it was just the air intake valve that broke, likely from the desert heat. It literally cost $4.50 to repair. That being all good, I realized that it was now close to sunset, so I changed my plans. I decided to forget Las Vegas and the Grand Canyon solo adventure, and hightail it out to the next destination city, all the way on the East Coast, Atlanta, Georgia. This would turn out to be the most terrifying night of my life. The flat tire was just the fear appetizer before the pure dread of hell that would be unleashed. So, I pull out of the tire shop, with determination to get to the East Coast as soon as I could, and not stop unless necessary. I decided I'm going to drive east as long as I can, until I am too tired, and then I will take a rest in my truck. Early in the eve, I was really enjoying the drive, with my crimson red and glittering gold sky behind me. The desert was beautiful in its vast empty serenity. As I spent most of the past 2 years in an office environment, I was feeling exhilaration by the chance to be under such a gigantic and beautiful open sky. The tall cactus were majestic and proud as they scrolled past my truck on each side. Sunset fell into darkness, and the celestial show above the desert was another display of natural world's unbelievable beauty. There was no moon. At one chance, I pulled over just to look up. The road was pretty empty. It was not quite midnight, and aside for stars, I could see the Milky Way, and when you see it like that, it really lives up to its name. Suddenly, I felt uncomfortable. I had a sense that my humble belongings packed under my camper top of old yellow Toyota pickup were not safe. I drove on. My fascination with the natural beauty soon waned until the night desert was like a hypnotist of sand and cactus counting down from 10 and putting me into a trance. The road was all mine at this hour, and it was one of those moments where it felt like I could be the only person alive on the planet. And then I saw something in my rearview mirror to remind me that I'm not alone. It wasn't a car though, it was a man. He was running, but as I was driving faster, I thought that I must have driven past him and just not seen him. I drove on, but I was no longer sleepy. I was wide awake and my mind was racing to rationalize what I had just seen. I didn't get a good view, but I had definitely seen a man. It just didn't add up. Something was off. I couldn't think of a scenario where a man would be running along a freeway late in the night, way out in the desert. I relaxed for some moments. I must just be seeing things, I thought to myself. Some of those cactus could make you think you saw something. I drove on, with an elevated sense of alertness. Now, I didn't want to stop. There might be something out there, and you know I'm going to see him again. I knew that night I would see him again. So I drove on. On that straight road leading east, I saw him again in my rearview mirror. This time, he was not fading away, but holding about the same speed, 10 or 12 car lengths back. I could barely see him. I checked my speed and I was going about 60 miles per hour. Impossible, I thought. I let my speed slag off a bit, and indeed the man got closer. I could see him for about 2 to 3 car lengths behind me now. He was illuminated slightly red from my back lights. He was naked and barefoot, and running as fast as he was. It was amazing and terrifying. What is this creature, and what does it want from me? I decided I had enough of it and floored it. My truck was pretty loaded, and doesn't accelerate good anyways, so as the speedometer moved ever so slowly up, my focus stayed on the man running behind the truck. He picked up speed and ran around, so that he was running in the incoming lane. I could see him real good now through my driver's side window. His hair was dark and pushed back about neck length. His skin was dark, and his face was black with angled white stripes, like he had some kind of war paint on it. I checked the speedometer and was hitting almost 90. I drove on and he ran with me. I did not understand how it or this man could run this fast and barefoot. He then accelerated faster than I was driving, and I watched him run off ahead at an insane speed. I couldn't believe the speed of those legs moving as he sprinted down the straight flat road. I drove on. With my heart pounding, adrenaline pumping, and sheer waves of dread pulsing through my body, I thought to turn around and go the opposite way, but realized that if he could run that fast, it doesn't matter. I hadn't seen any car or humans, at least a car he couldn't outrun. And then the truck bumped. There were stones on the highway. They were small stones, but I tapped on the brakes. Then I floored the brakes because the man was standing in the middle of the street with his arms up out like he was going to challenge me. He pointed both his index fingers at me with parallel arms, and then while holding his gaze, he wiped his neck with his finger horizontally from left to right, miming a throat cut by a mime. I understand this sign language. The man walked up to the outside by the driver's side door and tapped on my window several times. I was afraid to break the window. He was talking in some language, like a Native American language that made no sense to me. I could see his face very clearly. He did have some kind of black paint on his face with 3 white stripes under each eye and an oval on his forehead. He continued his rant, blustering with a firm gaze. I was relieved to see how 2 headlights in the rearview mirror now. A big rig was approaching. The man looked in the direction we had come from. He looked back at me and then I saw his eyes. They were dark. At that instant, the man ran off from the road and into the deep desert. The truck veered into the oncoming lane to pass my truck and shook and waned from the vacuum and force as the big rig passed, its blaring horn giving a deafening Doppler effect, and it passed. And in sudden silence, I watched the dust fall back over the road as the big rig slowly vanished into the darkness ahead. I drove on. The sun rose, and only stopping to get gas in New Mexico. I did not dare to take my sleep break until I was in Texas Wednesday night. I will not be doing any more driving in the deserts of the Southwest in America. I feel as though there was a spirit there that knows who I am, and we have unfinished business, and I prefer not to see him again. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, as it helps me out a lot. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification button, as you don't want to miss another video. I upload videos almost every single day on things creepy and anomalous. If you have a story that you'd like to hear on the channel, be sure to send it to the email or the website that you can find in the description down below. That is swampdweller.net. One word, swampdweller.net. I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.